I can't pee then. In there. Thank you, sir. You're the best. Thanks. And okay, and I can just change things. Oh, I got that. Cool. And so if I go to the right, I go ahead, right? So let me get some things out here. So y'all came here in the rain? Is that true? Man. So oh, I shouldn't talk. Sorry. Okay, thank you.
Go. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to a special celebration of real Florida and real Florida stories. I'm Diane McFarland, Dean of the College of Journalism and Communications, and I'm so pleased to be with you tonight for the latest in our series of great storytellers. Jeff Klinkenberg is truly one of Florida's great storytellers, not just my opinion. This year, the Florida Humanities Council presented Jeff with its prestigious Lifetime Achievement Award for writing. Jeff began experiencing Florida at an early age, learning its lore and meeting its characters. Over a journalism career that spanned nearly 4 decades, much of it at the Tampa Bay Times, he explored every nook and cranny of Florida in explaining the state's history and culture, the judges wrote in their citation. A previous winner, Carl Hiaasen, said that Jeff, quote, has a rare eye for marvelous detail and an affectionate ear for those small, wise, bittersweet voices that tell the true story of Florida. And can I tell you, I'm just a little bit proud that both Jeff and Carl are alumni of the College of Journalism and Communications. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks.
Point of pride. Jeff wrote about the likes of naked Ed Watts up at Lily Springs, who he called Loincloth Man. He tracked down and brought to the spotlight Mary Ann Carroll, the only woman among the famous highwayman artists of Fort Pierce. His deep appreciation for such Floridians also makes Jeff cranky about the hashtag Florida Man. He charges, and I agree, that it's a cruel stereotype and a distraction from the real Florida men and Florida women who are the fabric of this state. Jeff, I can't wait to hear your thoughts about how we can continue to find and craft the authentic stories of this hashtag age. One of our co-sponsors, the online magazine called The Marjory, has set out to do just this, and I want to congratulate that new generation of real Florida storytellers as we celebrate one who has been at it for a lifetime. And would our representatives from the Marjory please stand and be recognized? Great new venture. So my thanks to the Marjory and the Bob Graham Center for Public Service for co-sponsoring this event. And before I turn it over to Jeff, you missed our 50th anniversary celebration where we inducted the members of our new Hall of Fame. You got some bling here that I am very happy to present to you tonight with our congratulations on being a member of our Hall of Fame. So do you want to wear it?
Yeah, hell yes. Oops. Uh-oh. All right. Great. Can you still hear me? Yeah, you can? Okay, good. Well, thank you, Diane.
All right. Well, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Klinkenberg with our appreciation for you being here tonight.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can I get a hug? Yeah, all good. Yeah, thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So thank you for coming. And I have to tell you, I have not done this talk tonight. So I'm as interested in you to see how it turns out, really. I put together some of it just this week, just on Tuesday. So you heard some of my background. You know, I grew up in South Florida. I was a swamp boy. I was an Everglades boy who liked fishing and catching snakes. And I was, the founder of the Boys Without Dates, because as interested as I was and some friends were of girls, we had no idea what to do. And of course, our hands always smelled faintly of fish and snake musk. So we didn't have much luck. But from that background, I ended up with one of the greatest jobs in Florida journalism. And that was, my last editor would say, go out and find me something interesting. And I feel like I was in the tradition of William Bartram, who was an interpreter of Florida in the 19th century, or in the 18th century, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, who lived here in the 19th century, and Marjory Kinnan Rawlings, who came to Florida in 1928 and interpreted Florida through fiction and nonfiction, and my old friend Marjory Stoneman Douglas, who wrote the book on the Everglades, Everglades River of Grass in 1947. I'll talk a little bit about her because she is a real Florida woman, just as I am a real Florida man. So I don't know. Let's see if how this works. That's me in 1954 when there were fewer than 4 million people in Florida. Even bigger. I was even bigger then. So that's in Key West. I live in Key West. And that's my dad and I in Key West in 1954, 3.5 million people. So here's a Florida man in about 1967 in the Everglades. I think there were 5 or 6 million people in Florida then. And then, sadly, this is me recently, enjoying my cigarette after meeting Alberta. You didn't know about Alberta, did you? She's a hussy. But anyway, so 21 million people in Florida now. So I have seen a bunch of changes. And, when I was a kid, I just knew all these. I knew Florida women and Florida men. And they were fascinating to me then. And, I made this choice not to be a conventional journalist back after UF. I was working at the Miami News and decided the kinds of sports writing I was doing. I was covering professional football, that I just couldn't tell the stories I wanted to tell. And I discovered a New Yorker writer named John McPhee about then, and started to use storytelling techniques, magazine techniques, to tell interesting and sometimes complicated stories about Floridians. And I ended up at the St. Pete Times in '77, worked for Mr. Mike Foley, who was the city editor then, and later the managing editor, and later the editor of the St. Petersburg Times. And he teaches here at UF. How'd you like to be a student and be taught by somebody with that background? Mike, that's the only nice thing I'm going to say about you tonight, by the way. But anyway, so just like you, I've been hearing about Florida Man for it seems like 100 years. The Florida Man phenomenon actually started in 2013, but I go back to about 2000, the year 2000, with the hanging chads. That's when I think it really started, where Florida became a laughing stock because of of what happened in Palm Beach County, where there was the recount and recount and recount, and where people started to laugh at us as incompetent. And it just seemed then to, whenever something happened in Florida, that you'd hear about the recount and stuff. And so, Florida deserved a lot of that, but it started to wear on my nerves again. And then in 2013, I think it was 2013, this guy started the Florida Man tweet. That's what it looked like. And it's still on, you can still find it on Facebook and Twitter, and I subscribe to it. I look at it, and people just eat it up. I'm spitting into the wind when I speak out against Florida Man. I can't win this argument at this point, but I like to, I like my screeds every once in a while. So I've been thinking about this a long time. I've had private arguments with some friends of mine who write books about, they just thrive on Florida Man. They've sold a lot of books because of weird Florida and tabloid crime, and I just sort of finally started to say enough. And here's why. First of all, a lot of the Florida Man stuff you hear about and you read, and I should tell you that one of the things that made Florida Man so prolific, that made it just spread, was that, first of all, we're a state of 21 million people, as I told you, tremendous diversity, different cultures, different religions, a lot of poverty, a lot of alcoholism, a lot of substance abuse. And because we're big, a lot of things are going to happen in Florida, especially South Florida, where people are just crammed into a relatively small area. The other thing is, Florida has a wonderful law. It's called the Sunshine Law, which means that pretty much everything is open to the public, and it's a wonderful law. I would not want to close it just because I resent Florida Man, but what happens is reporters, and right now, newspaper staffs are smaller than they were when I started, and there are fewer people to cover even more news, and it can be pretty tempting to go into a police station and look at the police blotter, and there's all these crimes. Some of them may be a little complicated or may seem a little boring. Oh no, not another spousal abuse. I don't want to, write about that. They're a dime a dozen, but you get a story where, I don't know, somebody has hidden 100 oxy pills in their behind, and that's going to be, wow, there's something. And so that ends up in the paper, and then it ends up on Florida Man and maybe the late night television too. And we're the state of that. And for a while, whenever somebody would say, well, look at this weird crime. What, you live in Florida? What a hellhole. And I would Google often the same crime and find something similar happened somewhere else. And of course I'd say, well, and I always I like to go to Utah, the state of the Latter-day Saints, to find some weird crimes. So I would go there. Google, it would take a minute, and you'd find virtually the same crime there. So they're happening everywhere. And in fact, if you go to like Google or Amazon and you put weird Montana or weird New Jersey, there are all these books for weird New Jersey. So everybody's doing these things, but for some reason they stick in Florida. So that kind of irritates me. The other reason, though, and there's actually two other reasons that it starts to bother me, is that, first of all, as Diane mentioned, I mean, most of these people who end up in Florida Man things are sad, and they're just pitiful. Many of them are mentally ill, and they're out on the streets because our state really no longer cares for those people. People are discharged, they end up out in the street, and sometimes they commit crime, and sometimes they're bizarre crimes, and they get in the newspaper. And some of them are so odd. I used to laugh at them, and then I'd feel guilty because these aren't people that you really should make fun of, really. And they were a distraction, in my opinion, for some of the things that were really important and interesting about our state. And I'm going to talk about some of those things. Florida is an interesting place. I probably traveled more than any reporter in Florida for a long time, 8,000 to 15,000 miles a year. I was driving through Florida, big cities and small, from Pensacola to Key West. And, I was writing about interesting people doing interesting things. I was seeing interesting things. And all those years, I never saw any of those Florida Man things. Though I should tell you, I do have a taste for eccentrics. So Naked Ed just was right up my alley, because I like to... I guess I can tell you now that I do like skinny dipping. So when I went to see Ed, I'd heard about him, and someone gave me directions, and I, went to High Springs, and I turned left at the oak tree, and then if you go 100 feet, there's an opening in the fence, and I went through the fence, and okay, now you're going to see a really big cabbage palm. You're going to stop there and look around, and so I did that, and he materialized out of the gloom without his loincloth. And we went to his hut, and he's still there. It's in a place called Lily Springs off the Santa Fe River. And you can, if you go and rent a canoe at one of those places, they'll give you a map to Ed's place. So he's got that hut, and if there's a lot of people there, if the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts have arrived, he'll put on that that loincloth, and they do come to see him, I should tell you. He's got these Tupperware boxes full of loincloths for his visitors. But when I was there, it was just he and I thought, well, who the hell needs a loincloth when I could go skinny dipping here in the spring? So I did. And Ed had some advice for me, which I always remember now. He said, stay away from them shallows. I seen a snapping turtle. So whenever I'm skinny dipping now, I do I stay on my back if I can. So I do love people like that, you know. So, but that's different. Florida men and Florida women, for the most part, these are not generic Floridians who are just living here because of a job most of the time, and they're happy here because there's a Starbucks down the street, and there's a movie theater, and they can get everything they want. Florida men and Florida women, without the hashtag, are a little deeper. They're invested in Florida through, it could be nature, it could be something else, but it's something that's related to the place where they live. It might be their garden in the backyard and their struggles of trying to grow a decent tomato, which is very hard in Florida, or a hobby or whatever. But so when I think of Florida men and Florida women, I think of that. Here's the that's the hanging. Next time I do this, I'll do it so I'm coordinated with my photos. That photo ran everywhere in the world, I think. The hanging Chad was a serious story. I mean, and think about it. Without it, we may have had a different president then, who would have taken he would have taken seriously global warming. And here we are, 18 years later, and we haven't dealt with it. Our government has not dealt with it, and probably a future government will not either. So, you know, that had great consequences. In addition to pissing me off, you know, so, you know, more important reasons. So, fake Florida men, fake Florida women. I'm going to show you I'm going to point out some real Florida women. Diane from Lake Wales, newspaper editor and publisher for many years in Sarasota. Cynthia Barnett, one of the great environmental writers in the world, in my opinion, also in the Journalism Hall of Fame, long listed for the National Book Award for her last one. I can't wait to see her new one. I know there's some other people here that because I don't have my glasses on, I can't quite make you out. You're real Florida men and women, but you're a little blurred to me. So look at these people. Okay, these are the Florida men. And so these are people that we make fun of, who end up in the Florida Man columns. This guy, God, I forget what he did. He was an alcoholic. We have all kinds of religion in South Florida. There's voodoo, there's Santeria, and so there are a lot of these kinds of things happen in South Florida, and they're, you know, I would probably be a little upset if I found a headless goat floating behind my house, but, you know, okay, this is a religion, they get rid of stuff. This guy, come on, really? So here's our latest. This is the bomber from South Florida who sent the pipe bombs all over the country. And it just spurred, I don't know, Facebook and and obviously a deranged person and deserving of all kinds of coverage. But the Florida Man tag, Florida Man hashtag reared its head to where I started to see, and I'm sure some of you saw this too, only in Florida. This kind of person is only in Florida. And I was thinking, wait a minute, wasn't Timothy McVeigh from Kansas? I don't remember. Were there only in Kansas after the bombing in Oklahoma? And the Unabomber was from Montana, So I don't want to be a Pollyanna because pretty serious things, but a lot of the stuff is happening in other places. I told you when I see a lot of these Florida Man tag things, I like to look and see what else I can find. And here I'm picking on poor South Dakota, Utah man shot during naked home invasion, booked into jail. So even there in the Beehive State, some of these things happen, and those are my own little alligator toys that I have. So here's my favorite one of all time. This is South Dakota. Another, you don't think of as a high weird crime state, but surely things happen. And in this case, a woman woke up in the middle of the night. She sensed that somebody was in her house, and she had an infant in the next bedroom and went in there to find another woman breastfeeding her baby. So kind of funny, but the woman was drunk and went into the wrong house, and the baby looked kind of like hers, so she fed it. But the stuff does happen everywhere. Here's another favorite from North Dakota. A woman stabbed in cheek with own high heel. I don't know. I know that wasn't anybody in here, but that's quite a weird crime. Every once in a while, there are these things in Florida that are perfect. All the stars align. And here's one of them. So down in South Florida on the edge of the Everglades, at the big bingo parlor on the Miccosukee Reservation, somebody is breaking into cars, and the cops shine a light on him. So he takes off and he jumps into a lake where he's attacked and killed by an alligator. Not exactly funny, though I know Carl Hiaasen will have it in a novel sooner or later, because it is the Florida crime. That's where you have Florida and crime kind of coming together in a real way. So I don't consider that a Florida Man crime. That's real Florida. When I was coming up here yesterday, and by the way, I drive over Tampa Bay, I see dolphins herding mullet when I go over the Howard Franklin Bridge. And I know what's happening. I've lived here all my life. I've paid attention. And I know that's what those dolphins are doing. They're herding mullet. And in December, those mullet in enormous schools are going to go out to the Gulf and spawn. So I'm thrilled. And you're driving over the Howard Franklin Bridge, and I'm seeing osprey on the poles. And what it reminds me of is when I was a kid, you didn't see many osprey. You didn't see many bald eagles. Pelicans were in shorter supply. Why? Because of DDT in the food chain. And we got DDT out of the food chain, and now there are ospreys everywhere. So I'm seeing that as a Florida man. It's not a casual observation. I'm looking at that, and I know what it means. So I'm on the interstate, and I stop at my favorite rest stop. It's the one just north of Micanopy, northbound. And I love that one because you get out of your car and there's a sign that says something like, "Caution, venomous snakes." And I just love that, and hey, tourists, come on over here and look at the cottonmouth. But I like, that sort of, that's a Florida phenomenon. You're not going to see that in New York City, So I see that, and then because I'm an old bastard and I have this long memory, I remember about 20 years ago there was this bust of a prostitution ring at that rest stop, where there were like these lonely truck drivers where they had prostitutes coming from, I think, Gainesville or Miami to comfort, I guess you would call it, these lonely truck drivers. And I thought, God, isn't that sort of don't you love that where you got the cottonmouths and the prostitutes in the same place, you know? And what happens, when the truck driver has to go to the restroom and it's dark and hears something rustling in the grass? Carl could do something with that too. So Florida is everywhere. And so this story had a sad ending, but it was a real Florida story. I already told you that global warming is a problem. And Cynthia, when I do this next time, we will coordinate the talking with with some of my photographs. But this is what global warming is going to be like. It's going to be like Moses crossing the sea, and then the water comes in and drowns all the bad people. Here's something else, the blue-green algae, and we're still trying to figure out what is this, because we know it's from pollution in the lake. It's getting in the Gulf. And I can't remember if it's in the Atlantic, but it's certainly in the Gulf and Lake Okeechobee, and it's a terrible thing for tourism. And of course there's a boat going across the lake, and it's been a disaster if you live on the Gulf like I do, and add to that now is red tide. That's been the worst red tide season in history, or known history, and it should be over by now, and it isn't. And where people are trying to figure out why that is. It's a natural phenomenon, red tide is, but why is it? Does that have something to do with global warming, with pollution? We just don't know. We're trying to find that out. I have just went to Captiva on vacation, and it was bad timing. So I'm afraid they may meet with this. Invasive reptiles, invasive plants. The guy on the right is a friend of mine. This photo, by the way, was taken in 1990, before the python was on our radar. This is not the Burmese python. It's the reticulated python. This is the longest snake on earth. They're reproducing in South Florida. There aren't as many reticulated pythons as the Burmese pythons, which is the poster boy, but this one was over 20 feet. It was under a house in Broward County. The smaller blonde guy, Todd Hardwick, runs a business called Pesky Critters, and he usually catches possums, in your attic. And this elderly couple heard a woman screaming in their backyard. The old man went out in the rain with his flashlight and saw something that made him very unhappy, and it was this giant python that was strangling and swallowing about a 30-pound raccoon. And then even worse, it crawled under his house. And nobody believed this guy that this giant snake was there, and called Pesky Critters, and Todd went and crawled under the house with 3 big husky guys, including my friend Joe Wasilewski, who now is the big American crocodile scientist in South Florida, and he's currently catching pythons in Everglades National Park. But he was part of this expedition. They crawled under this house in Broward County, and it wasn't like a crawl space where you crawled under you could see the back of the property. The walls from the house went down to the ground. So there were these like squares of dirt, and then it would stop. But there were these holes under the walls like this, and they knew something big was down there, and they kept crawling through, and eventually they determined that this thing was in under a corner bedroom, and one of them went outside and got a garbage can lid and blocked it, and then the other guys were outside and dug a hole in the corner of the outside the corner of the house, and Todd went in head first with the other guys holding his legs, and he had a catch pole, which is a pole with a noose, and she was there, and she was frantic. She was going around this room. She couldn't escape because the guys were on the other side, and Todd got it. And by the way, Todd is about 5'4", wears this big cowboy hat. He says, the only difference between me and John Wayne is dead. But he got that snake. She came up right at him, and everybody else pulled him and the snake out on the lawn. South Florida media fled. Nobody got any video of this, but Bill Cook, a photographer for AP, got this photograph that I like to pull out from time to time. So that's been happening a long time, and it's an enormous problem for the Everglades. Not only all the reptiles from foreign lands that are out there, but also plants. Traffic everywhere. We have all these infrastructure problems, and they don't get better because we don't spend money. And I blame Florida man for that, but it is a distraction. Our schools, public schools, at the St. Pete Times won a Pulitzer for this. Some schools that just were bad schools, and kids were not being educated. Called it failure factories. So here's the terrible story from Martin County about the man who had 100 oxy pills in his rectum. It was a way of escaping. But there are real Florida men and real Florida women, and here are some of them. This is Michael Gannon, the late Michael Gannon, who was my, when I came to UF, I was still a practicing Catholic, and he was my pastor. He was the radical priest. He was one of the great speakers, and he went to Vietnam because he wanted to check out the war himself, and came back, and he sort of, tried to manage the students like me and the administration and the police. And more than once, he smelled tear gas and got clubbed once. He ended up leaving the priesthood just to teach history. I took 2 Florida history classes with him. He's a UF graduate from St. Augustine. And he was the first winner of the Lifetime Achievement for Writing from the Florida Humanities Council. We stayed friends until he passed. And I don't know if his former, is Gigi here? Oh, I haven't seen you in a while, but welcome, thank you. And as I've told you, Michael had a great influence on me in many ways. So I am grateful for the day that we met, and thank you for coming. Carl Hiaasen, UF graduate, and it's interesting, Carl, in Carl's novels, there are a lot of weird people. If you've heard him speak, he will tell you, I don't have to make things up. However, he doesn't make fun of the people who don't deserve to be ridiculed. He usually attacks people of power and some real evil people. And of course he's writing fiction for the most part, and it's just brilliant. He writes brilliant satires, and I couldn't be a bigger fan. I do resent him because he's very tall and handsome and makes a lot of money. So damn it, So here's Marjory Stoneman Douglas, Marjory Kinnan Rawlings. We'll talk about them a little. There is Marianne Carroll. I did some of the first. I was one of the first writers to discover the highwaymen or the highwaymen painters, the rediscovery, I will say, because they started in 1954, and they sort of started to disappear in the 90s. And a friend of mine, state anthropology meeting, and someone had done a paper on these guys. I'd never heard of them, and I started to go to Fort Pierce to try to talk to them, and nobody wanted to admit that they were painters. As far as they were concerned, I was the man. They had been selling painters, probably not reporting income tax. They didn't want to talk to me. I kept at it, and I ended up writing 4 or 5 stories, and this was the last one I wrote. It's in my book, my new book, Son of Real Florida. She's the only woman. What a person. We'll talk about her. Tom Petty, a Florida man from Gainesville. He had a great sense of place. It was in his music, and he grew up here. And I mean, he wrote. Some of you have probably heard a song that he never released, and his ex-band people released it a couple weeks ago. It's called Gainesville. It's really cool. I hope you'll listen to it. Have you heard that? Have you heard it? And look at Mike. I'm sorry I did this to you. If I cut off I didn't want to see your face, but this is Mike Foley, my friend as the drummer in the world's greatest band, the Fabulous Nosecaps, from Clearwater High School. And look, here's Mike's childhood picture. No, it isn't. He was beaten up a lot, but no, that isn't Mike. But I wish it was you. Michael Connolly, Florida man from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. He sells, I don't know, 1 million books a year, if not more. One of the world's nicest guys. Foley is in one of his books. He likes to put the names of his friends in books. I'm in his new book that just came out. I am Sergeant Klinkenberg in that book, and I have to tell you, Sergeant Klinkenberg is a manly man. He's quite a stud. So I don't know who Michael was thinking about when he did that, but flattered as hell. This Johnny Tiger, Miccosukee. They're very difficult I have found it very difficult to write about Native Americans, very suspicious. But he's just a wonderful guy. He runs an airboat concession, and he just tells you everything. His grandmother died a couple of years ago at age 112, taught him medicine. She was a medicine woman. He can speak the native language, Miccosukee, which is disappearing. It's a great story. And I wrote about it once years ago, this disappearing culture. And a lot of the Miccosukees and Seminoles, the older people, believe that when traditional stories that cannot be told, if traditional stories have to be told in the native language. And if they can't, then the culture is gone. And so he is carrying on that culture. This is cowboy Jim Everett, who died recently, a black cowboy, very unusual in Florida in his 80s. So you can imagine what it may have been like to be a black cowboy in your 20s in Central Florida. So he went through all of that. I have an essay about him in Son of Real Florida, and also one about Johnny Tiger, too. Here's a Florida woman. That's Lucy Morgan, perhaps the greatest investigative reporter who ever walked on the Florida earth. High school graduate, she didn't go to the university. Hired by the St. Pete Times. Her future husband was looking for somebody to do not important work, but went to the library and said, who reads the most books in Pasco County? And the library said, well, that's Lucy Ware. And so Jim hired, or Richard hired Lucy Ware, and she ended up winning one Pulitzer, and it was a finalist in another. Thick Mississippi accent. I know Mike and the J School has had her up here, and she knits. She is the book you can't cover, and I don't know how many good old boys in Tallahassee that she trapped because they would listen, they'd hear that accent and see her knitting and not take her seriously, and she would catch them. And I mean, if you were up to no good and your secretary said Lucy Morgan on the phone, it was not a good day for you. Recognize that guy on the right? That's the Bull Gator. That's Ray Graves. And when I was a student up here and I was a stringer for a lot of newspapers in Florida, he was the coach. And I kept in touch with him until he died. He died a few years ago in his 90s. His daughter, Beth, who was the yearbook editor when I was here, was a great friend. And she'd have a New Year's Day party in Clearwater, and Ray was always there. And I would sit next to him, and we'd watch football. And it was, it was just wonderful to listen to him comment on the game. That's Gary Mormino. He is the co-founder of the Florida Studies program at the University of Florida. I was the first writer in residence for that. It's a graduate program for people who it's sort of like American Studies, but there we use Florida to study literature, geography, marine biology, and culture. And Gary started that. We got Bob Graham. Bob Graham came and spent a couple days there because he was wondering if he could do something like that at UF. And he may have shelved it or it might be shelved, but I hope that happens sometime because it's a wonderful program and it's important. And Cynthia, did you ever do any speaking there for? Yeah. Yeah, and I saw you a couple weeks ago. Yeah, but he was one of the greats. He's very Italian, so he was pleased with this veggie pasta that my wife Susan made for him. I'm sorry I did this to some of the photos. I'll fix them, but that's Bob Graham, and I've known him for a million years, and I've written a couple stories, and one of the memorable story for me was I went down to Miami Lakes, which he has lived all his life when he wasn't in Tallahassee or Washington, and he took me to his childhood home where his values came from. And it was somebody else lived there, but we went to the fence, and when he was a boy, it was on the edge of the Everglades, and now it was in Miami Lakes, and there were houses with barbed wire on the windows and stuff, but we went there and there was a fence, and Bob is kind of a button-down guy, and we just had our hands in the fence, and he'd say, "Oh, that corner bedroom, that's where I was, and my sister was over here, and the morning was like that, and I'm a nosy reporter. What time did you get up? What did you have for breakfast? Blah 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 blah. And you had a car? Yeah, I had a Packard, and God, that's a long way to go to Miami High School. Reporters. That's how we are." A Florida man on the left. That's the famous George Burgess, the world expert on shark attacks. His office is a quarter of a mile from here. He just retired though, but he is the expert on shark attacks. I did a 12,000-word essay on him for the University of Florida a couple of years, and I was proud of it. It was good reporting, and God, what a read it was, really. When do most attacked by sharks? So I should tell you that Florida is the shark attack capital of the world, more here than anywhere else, and East Coast more than the West Coast. But he asked me that, when do people get attacked by sharks? And I said, well, between dusk and dawn. And he said, well, you'd think that, except people aren't in the water. People get attacked by sharks between 10 a.m. and 7 p.m. Why is that? Because that's when people are in the water. But there's a drop-off between noon and 1 p.m. Why is that? Because people go to lunch. He's just fascinating. And I followed him around Florida when I was doing that story. And, I heard him. He did talks to trauma surgeons, because most surgeons have never seen a shark bite, just to that photo at one of those things. Ross Allen, I grew up idolizing. He was at Silver Springs Reptile Institute, and man, a lot of Florida boys wanted Ross Allen, and I did. This is characters. This is Lucky Cole, who lives down in the Big Cypress. This is the first time I met him. He's about 6'4". He was my age, but he had dyed his beard and his hair jet black. And he had so much hair on his arm, I couldn't see what the tattoo was. And when I first went in there, he's in a place called the Loop Road, I was scared when he came out. But he was a lovely guy, and one of those eccentrics I like. And we were sitting on his deck, and I was in a barber's chair, and he was in a dentist's chair. That was his desk furniture. And I looked over his head, and there was this big black and white photograph of a very attractive woman, probably around, in her 50s, who was half naked. And I said, well, Lucky, who's that? He said, well, that's Maureen, my wife. And I had one of those moments where, what am I supposed to say anything, or where should I put my eyes? But Lucky is just, what a colorful person he is. This business, believe it or not, it's a word of mouth thing. He takes pictures of women, usually middle-aged women. They're kind of PG-17 photographs for the most part, of women in Everglades scenes. And they're usually, they're a little bit. One time I was down in South Florida visiting my friend Clyde Butcher, the photographer. And I said, Clyde, do you want to meet Lucky? He said, I don't know. Clyde is Mr. Straight-Laced. He's never had a drink of alcohol. I've never heard him curse. And he was reluctant. His wife said, we're going. So I took him there to meet Lucky, and these guys hit it off like you wouldn't believe. They still see each other. We're talking about the sublime to the ridiculous. And Clyde even bought a less racy photograph. I'm sorry again about this. Is 2/3 of Toch Brown. He was a notorious alligator poacher in the Everglades, and everybody had heard about him. Everybody knew about him, but he was never caught. And but finally, he wrote a book about it when he was about 70. He wrote a book about it, and then somebody ghost wrote the book about Clyde and about Toch, and he was willing to talk. And as a reporter, I just never liked to talk to people on the phone unless I had to. I always like to go in person. So I went down there, and we sat in his living room for a while, and I finally said, Toch, I would love to see the Everglades through your eyes. So we went out in his boat. We spent 5 hours there, and we'd go into these mangrove creeks where you had to lie on the bottom of the boat to get through them, because he wanted to show me a place where he had killed alligators. He was never caught. He was just too wily. He had a heart condition, and alligator poaching is very physical, so he needed to find another way to make a living that was a little easier on his body. So he became a drug smuggler when he was like 64 or 65, and he was finally arrested, but he wasn't convicted of drug smuggling. He was convicted of income tax evasion. Al Capone crime. I had this amazing day with him, and there was this moment where we're in Everglades National Park, mind you, and a threatened species called the white ibis flies over. And Todd says, Jeff, we called them Chokoloskee chickens. They ate them during the Depression. And a little while later, there's a a flock of immature white ibis that are a little dark. And he said, we used to stew them. And a couple other times he mentioned, how good they tasted. And I finally said to him, I said, Touch, are you ever tempted to come out here with your shotgun? And he comes up, and I represent the largest newspaper south of Washington, D.C. We've been talking for a couple of hours by then. I've got my notebook out. I've got a photographer in the boat with me. And Touch, he's like one of those close talkers. He gets right in my face. He said, Jeff, I'm not only tempted, I do it all the time. So he was killing threatened birds in Everglades National Park in the 90s, Quite a rascal. Man, did I like him. He was just, he was great to write about, and there was just something about him, and he justified this stuff. He'd been a commercial fisherman, and his dad had been, and his granddad, and, when Everglades National Park was founded in 1947, he lost his livelihood. So, damn it, he was going to, and for years you could kill alligators, and then they were protected, but he just kept killing. He was just one of these wild Everglades men. And there's me, and there's Peter, God, I can't think of his name, but we did some stories in the Everglades and the Keys a couple of years ago. Let's see, we'll go to, this is my friend Joey Roberts. He's a park ranger at a park in the Keys. I'm sorry, my mind just, had one of those old moments. Ligman Vitae State Park. It's an island off of Islamorada that is managed like it's 1513. And this was June, and the mosquitoes are so ferocious you have to wear these things. And it's still scary because they're so loud. The Coppertone girl from... I found out she was alive, and she was living in Ocala, and I called her up and said, I want to write a story about you. She said, oh, no, not that story. You should write about her. And I thought, oh, no, don't tell me to write it. I'm thinking of a woman, I don't know. I was stereotyping what an old woman was like. But her mother did this, was a commercial artist. But on the woman on the right, that was Bunny Yeager when I was a kid. She went to Miami Edison High School. Where I went, though, she went earlier, and she was one of the first real cheesecake photographers, Miami Beach. And that's the woman next to her is that famous, there's a movie about her, Betty Page. So she discovered Betty Page. Bunny, I wrote an essay about her in Alligators in B flat. I found out she was alive. I couldn't imagine. I got a phone number and called her up, and she'd say, I'd say, I'd like to come down. And she'd say, oh, no, I'm too busy. And so I sent her a couple copies of my books, and I thought that might entice her. And in the note with the books, I said that the book one of the books had a blurb from Carl Hiaasen on the back. And so I called her up, and she said, well, do you know Carl Hiaasen? Damn him. But anyway, even Carl Hiaasen wouldn't unlock her heart to me. And finally, one day I just called her and said, I'm coming down. And she left a message. By then, she wasn't answering my calls. I was a pest. But I just said, I'm coming down. And she did call me, and she said that in the big art district in Miami, there was going to be an exhibit of her photographs. And I was welcome to come to that, and she was going to be there. And I went, and of course, she didn't show. But I wrote this, sometimes the big one that got away makes a better story, and that was one of the case. But Florida Woman, this is Patrick Smith, who wrote the most popular novel ever published in Florida, I will say. And that's A Land Remembered, and this is late in his life. He lived over in Brevard County. I got to know him, and we would talk on the phone. And he was just a tough old cob. And he was from Mississippi, and he went to the University of Mississippi. He had memories of seeing Faulkner walk across the campus. His hero was Marjory Kinnan Rawlings, though. He ended up working in a kind of administrative job over, I want to say, maybe Edison Junior College, and started writing these novels and that were Florida related. And in 1980, he spent 4 years researching the cattle ranching business, and then wrote this novel. He could not find a publisher except Pineapple Press, this little press in Sarasota, and I don't know, it sold 500,000 books or something. But he died a couple years ago. Stetson Kennedy, a Florida man, I knew him well. He was kind of a rascal. He was one of the editors of the WPA Guide to Florida, which is a classic book that I always recommend Floridians pick up. It's kind of a G-rated book of what to see in Florida, published in 1939. Zora Neale Hurston worked for him. She was an amazing folklorist, and she had already published. Thank you. I had another one of those moments. She'd already, but it didn't make any money, so she was picking up work where she could. So she worked for Stetson. Quite a rascal, I have to say. Married 5, maybe 6 times, maybe a couple times to the same woman. He just kind of like Zora. He was sort of self-invented in a way. You never quite knew if what he was telling you was the truth, But he died a couple years ago, but one of the great folklorists who ever lived. One time I was at his house, and the phone rings, and he was cranky, he couldn't hear, and he says, "Here, talk to this." And it was, who was that? It was Studs Terkel, this famous, had a radio show in Chicago, a radical communist sympathizer back in the day, a folklorist, and it was Studs wanting to talk to. So I was the interpreter. I was telling Stetson what Studs was telling us, and Studs wanted to dictate something. So I took dictation, and this kind of this deep, fast voice. He'd read something to me, and space, period. He liked to put the he liked to put the space between the period and the next sentence, which isn't done anymore. But he was, and he'd say, "Read it back," So holy God, I did it. So anyway, sorry. Here's Zora. Their eyes were wide. There's Ed Watts, another Florida man. This is a story that Mike Foley talks about in his class. For years I was seeing this on gas pumps. There are 50,000 gas pumps in Florida. The scariest looking trooper you ever saw. And one day I was in East Point, which is near Apalachicola, and I was looking at this picture as I was filling my gas tank, and a trooper pulled up in the next lane, and there he was. He was real. So a former Marine who ironed his uniform every day. So I wrote a piece about that. And, every once in a while we'd keep in touch. He seemed to like me. He liked the story I wrote. He did not like the story, but he did. From Clearwater, just like all the greats are. This is what, Diane, doesn't this make you proud of me? Swamp Ape is a Florida man. This is down in the Everglades. And that's Caligula. He doesn't belong there, but I like him anyway. So I'm going to tell you a couple stories, and then we'll call it a night. The door is locked, by the way. You can't get out anyway. But about some people I had the pleasure of knowing. Grew up in Miami. Marjory Douglas was already an icon, and she'd come to Florida from, I want to say, the Northeast in 1915 after divorce to work for her daddy's newspaper, the Miami Herald. Her dad said, "Okay, we'll put you in the women's section." She said, "No, I don't want to work in the women's section. I can report." So she did. Very accomplished writer, polished writer, started to write magazine pieces and fiction. And in 1940, there was an editor called her who was publishing books that were called the Rivers of America series. And asked her to write a book about the Miami River. And she said, well, Miami River is an inch long. Let me write about the Everglades. And the editor said, well, madam, the Everglades is not a river. And she said, you're wrong. It's a river of grass. And so she wrote the Bible, and it's still a wonderful book. Came out in 1947, the year the Everglades National Park opened. And she was 68 years old then. I'm 69, she was 68 when it came out. And she certainly earned a retirement. But in 1972, there was an attempt to build a jetport out in the Everglades. And younger friends said, well, Marjory, you got to do something about it. And so she started an organization called the Friends of the Everglades, which is still there advocating for the Everglades, stop the jetport. And I like to talk about her now because of what happened in Broward County earlier this year, the shooting and the murders of students. And I realized when that happened, I mean, obviously the crime was the killing of lots of students and terrible tragedy. But I realized that nobody knew who she was by then. In Florida, history is whatever happened 2 years ago, So I contributed to a Washington Post story about her, as did Jack Davis, who won the Pulitzer Prize for the Gulf, who's teaches here at UF. But people got reminded of who she was because of this tragedy. I was a big fan. I'd never met her, and I'd corresponded with her. I had letters from her whenever I'd write something about the Everglades. I'd send it to her, and she always would send me back a polite letter. But in 1973, or 1992, actually, I decided to write a collection. Wanted to write 12 essays about the Everglades, and I used Mark Twain's Life on the Mississippi as a model, where I was going to start in the Kissimmee Basin, where the Everglades begin, and work my way down and write reported essays about it. And I decided, the first essay has got to be about Marjory. So I went down to Coconut Grove, where she lived, and had a great interview. I thought it was just because she was old. She was 102 years old at that point, spoke in perfect paragraphs. And I thought she would just lose her patience. She couldn't hear, she couldn't see. She had an aide. I would shout at the aide, and he would shout in her ear. Hearing aids stopped working completely, but I had I was there until 5 o'clock. I came there at 1. I was there at 5 o'clock, and I was a drinking man back then, and she had a taste for scotch. I was a beer drinker. I had a glass like this, and she did too. And she was like, 90 pounds. And I thought, I'll never get home alive. So I had to stop. I would have been under the table after a couple scotch, I wasn't a scotch guy, But we had a great talk. She got mad at me once. I was trying to tell her about the Florida Panther program. They put radio collars on the Panthers so they could monitor their movements. And she said, well, that sounds to me, she was very imperious. She said, that sounds to me like the utmost cruelty. And I said, oh, no, Mrs. Douglas, they're doing this. They don't know much about panthers and how they move. And she said, my cat Willie doesn't even like flea collars. And I realized she was the ultimate cat person. She had these cat doors in this house, and I tried to explain again, and she said, Lord have mercy, like the world's biggest idiot was in her living room. But and so I sent her every one of those Everglades pieces, and she'd write through her secretary. She'd write something back, and she would always sign it, and I have those, and I treasure them. But look at this. Here she is in 1947. That's at Burdines, which was once the Florida store, now gone. Macy's. Was part of the Macy's chain, and that was her. She always wore those hats, and she always wore pearls. And even when I interviewed her, she was in her nightgown and wearing pearls. And after the murders in South Florida, You know, I probably am on Facebook much too much, but I was seeing people, you know, people who knew who she was were saying, "Oh, she's rolling in her grave," blah blah blah, and of course she would have been distressed about what happened there. But I'll tell you something, she would have been invigorated by those students who stood up to the powers that be in our state and who were not intimidated by the National Rifle Association or the Trump administration. And just last week, I mean, they were out there, some of them voting for the first time, were out there registering voters. She would have loved that because she was the same way. She was a fighter. She was an advocate. And she'd march into that legislature back in the day when, it's still good old boys there, but back then the Democrats were good old boys. And she'd go up against them, this tiny woman who was very articulate and on fire. Bob Graham, she loved Bob Graham, but she would get in Bob Graham's face, but Bob Graham liked to come up behind her and ask him about this. And Bob would put his hands in front of her eyes. Of course, she was blind anyway. He didn't have to do that. And he would say, "Guess who?" And she'd say, "Is that my Everglades boy?" But anyway, rest in peace. But she wouldn't be at peace. So let's see. I'm going to go through this one, as fascinating as it is. Highwaymen Painters started in 1954, and Mary Ann Carroll was the only woman. And I spent a couple days with her down in Fort Pierce, where she lives. An amazing woman. Marjory Stoneman Douglas would have loved her because she was of the same ilk, a fighter. She started painting in the late 50s, the only woman in a pretty sexist world. People would tease her, never gave up. In her lifetime, she was a carpenter. She'd be working next to men, building houses. She cut lawns. She had 6 kids. She painted. And when I saw her, she also was running a storefront church in Fort Pierce, and she had taught herself how to play the organ. And you should have heard her sing. And I just love the idea that the highwayman tradition was to put these paintings still smelling of oil in your trunk and then go down the road and sell them. She was still doing that. Kinnan Rawlings, and then this for you Marjories. But I'm not going to talk much about her. I'm going to talk about Dessie Prescott Smith. Some of you know who she was. Dessie was, here's a picture of Dessie. Cross Creek. The second to last chapter, Cross Creek, is called Hyacinth Drift, and it's about this boat trip that he and Marjory took on the St. Johns River after Rawlings broke up with her husband, Charles. And Dessie said, what you need is a river trip, and they went out there. So Dessie was an amazing woman. She taught how to hunt and fish. And when Charles and Marjory moved to Cross Creek, naively thinking, well, these oranges will grow themselves while we write. She was going to write Gothic mysteries, and he was going to write for men's magazines. And, they would have starved without Dessie. So Dessie showed him how, and I'm kind of guessing she also taught Rawlings how to curse and how to drink. And I knew her a little bit from these Rawlings Society meetings, and I would go, and she would be there. And one day I said, Dessie, I'd love to. She lived in Crystal River, and I said, I'd love to come and see you. And again, I like to. You have to do stories. You want to do stories if you're a writer in your story subject's natural habitat. And back then it was, she was living in this house that had been a hunting camp, and she had been a hunting guide. And by then she'd been married, I don't know, 5 or 6. She'd divorced or outlived 5 or 6 husbands. But just recently, an English professor here on campus, his name is Kevin McCarthy, called me up and asked me if I would write. He's doing a book on Desi, and he asked me if I would write something for his book. So I did. I'm going to read it to you. And I say, here's what you need to know about my friend Desi. One time, after she was bitten by a mad bobcat, a friend wondered if a rabies shot might be in order. Not yet, she said. There are a few people I need to bite first. What else can I tell you? In her 9 decades, she had been a orange picker, a salad maker, a busgirl, and a waitress. She'd been a soldier. She knew how to grow things and to hunt and fish and trap. She knew how to skin a skunk. Desi had worked as a hairdresser, a real estate agent, and a car saleswoman. She had toiled as a municipal license inspector, a barnstorming pilot, and a military officer. She was no stranger to strong drink or to swear words. She always slept with a shotgun next to her bed. She had married, outlived, or divorced 6 husbands. I took her to lunch one day, and she didn't wait for me to order my food. She ordered for me. I reckon that she didn't like dawdlers of the male gender. But she passed. But my God, here she is as a hunting guide. That's her behind the wheel. She was something. And she lived, Island Grove, which is just a little east of Cross Creek. There's a couple of people there's at least one other person who knew her well. He's still alive. I also wrote about. I'm going to tell 2 more stories, and then I know you're going to rush to buy my book, so I don't want to interfere with book selling time. But this is Nathan Martin. I wrote about him in 2013. I think it's the best story I ever wrote, the best profile. And I heard about this guy who was living in the woods who never wore shoes or seldom wore shoes. And he wore clothes that looked like they'd been torn apart by wild animals. And I found out they had. And it took me a year to track him down. And I went up. He lived in Gilchrist County, which is west of Alachua County, a poor county, mostly logging still goes on. He was living in the middle of the woods on property where his dad had lived and his granddad and his great-granddad. And he was living like it was he was still the 19th century. But I didn't go up there for that. I went up there because I was interested in his bare feet as a Florida culture thing. Because when I was a kid, everybody went barefoot, I don't know how I didn't get tetanus. I stepped on so many nails. But I was sort of interested in an older guy who was still doing that. Well, what happened? Sometimes something superficial draws you, and then you find out that it's much more complicated than just bare feet, though that was significant too. And so I ended up spending, I'd go up there off and on for 4 weeks because every time I went up there, I would learn something else. And Melissa Little, a University of Florida graduate, was my photographer, and she shot the video. And if you go to my website, jeffklinkenberg.com, you can see the story and the video. And the story is in Centerville, Florida. So I go up there. He was living in what I would call it a cracker house that his dad had lived in and his granddad had lived in. It was a 2-room house with no plumbing, no indoor plumbing. He'd pee outside. Had 1 light bulb, and he cooked on a wood-burning stove, and heated wood-burning stove. Though the day I arrived, I guess he hadn't cooked because the stove was cool, but he was reading. And he was reading the memoirs of U.S. Grant. And that's literature. Grant was a wonderful writer. And he was reading that. And if you talked to him and, he heard ain't and, he was a country boy and that's how he sounded. And he was in 8th grade, and an 8th grade education. it was interesting to see him reading that. And he was interested in the Civil War in Florida and quickly took the conversation over my head and noticed my embarrassment and changed the subject. He said, let's talk about World War II. You'll know more about that. But found out he'd read his way through the Gilchrist County Library. Although he said, not romance or science. He didn't read that. He read fiction, but he mostly read nonfiction history. So I'm thinking, okay, I went up there because this guy has bare feet, and now I find out how smart he is. And then I find out he was easily the most self-reliant person I've ever known. He could do anything. He could have built himself a fine house. He knew roofing. He knew construction. He knew plumbing, even though he didn't have plumbing in his house. He could hunt. He could fish. He grew these amazing gardens, planting by the moon. He had money. He had worked for the roads department for 38 years. He just didn't like to spend it. And I began to see him as kind of a Thoreauvian character, but living in the 21st century. He was a 19th century man. He was living in the 21st century. And I kind of, looked at myself and, man, I liked things. I like shiny toys, expensive toys, I like that nice vehicle, I like the nice stereo. I have all these wants, things that I don't need, though. And he had come to this place in life where he may have wanted things, but he also knew he didn't need them. So that's how he lived, close to the bottom. He had a 1985 pickup truck that when he bought it, it had 200,000 miles on it, and it didn't work. But he could do mechanical work. He got it working. He still has it. It's got, 500,000 miles on it. One day I stopped at Bell or Mayo, 20 miles away, and at a McDonald's, the big restaurant in that town, and bought us both coffee. And he'd never had coffee from McDonald's. He'd never been in a McDonald's. He'd never been to Miami, never been to Orlando. And then I find out he'd been married twice, and part of me is thinking, well, who'd want to, as nice as he is and as interesting he is, would he'd be the ultimate boy without a date, as far as I was concerned. But he told me he'd been married for the first time at 16, and when he was 19, she said, Nathan, you're too country. And that was the end of that. It broke his heart. He went a little wild. He joined the military. He actually, during Vietnam, he was stationed, I think, in Germany for a while, came back to Florida and never left Gilchrist County. And then one day this woman calls him up, and she knew him when they were children. And she had divorced too. And Nathan was a real hunk when he was young. And she suggested they get together for coffee. Nathan had 2 pairs of shoes. One, 25 years ago, he bought some shoes at Walmart to go to a friend's funeral. And then he had another pair, a more casual pair, that he'd gotten out of a dumpster. So he put on his good shoes and took her to lunch, and they ended up married. They were married for 20 years. She had never been in his house. Weekend marriage. And so one of our trips up there, Melissa and I went to her house with Nathan for dinner, which in the South, that's lunch. And is Vida here by any chance? Vida, last time I was in Alachua County, Vida came. Vida made us this amazing dinner, and vegetables were from his garden. And there he is. Where's that jacket? 40 years old. Safety pins. He tried to free a bobcat kitten from a fence, and it got torn up, and he kept it. And there was the day we went to lunch. There was Vida, beautiful woman still, and um, afterwards, after this wonderful dinner, we went to the living room, and they sat down, and they kissed like an old married couple. And she said, Nathan, if you leave that shirt here, I'd like to burn it. And he said, oh no, ma'am. I love that shirt. And I said, well, Vida, what do you think about Nathan's feet? And she said, well, Jeff, sometimes I just can't stand them. There he is. I just can't stand him, so I get out the rose clippers and I clip his toenails. And, I said, it may not be, it may not be what we think of as romance, but it is romance, It's not a hallmark marriage. Took me into the family graveyard, and we went generation. Told me everything about his kin, and there was a space for him that he was going to be buried in. And last summer, he died of a blood disease, and he's buried there without his shoes on. And easily the most interesting person I think I ever met. And somebody, if you're a good reporter, you could never know everything. You always have to be a student. And, I sort of became his student in a way. Here's my last one, and this is my favorite one. About when I was in college, at Miami-Dade Junior College in 1968, I was a sports editor, and one day this guy walks in. He's about this big. He was dressed in camouflage from head to toe. And he came up to me, and he towered over me, and he said, I want to write about hunting and fishing. And he was like pugnacious, and it was like, a city boy like me would just be shocked at the idea of people actually, catch fish and eat them and shoot deer and eat them. I said, oh, and he didn't know I was a boy without a date. And I said, go for it. So my joke was, during the age of Aquarius, we were the only college newspaper in the country that had an outdoors editor, and that was Tim Chapman. So, I ended up at UF. He ended up at the University of Miami. I worked at the St. Pete Times for 38 years. He ended up at the Miami Herald for 40. He was an amazing photographer, and he was famous for the assignments, things he would do. The earthquakes, the civil disturbances, the uprisings in Haiti, the revolutions, he would go. His boots were the first on the ground at Jonestown. He rappelled down and took photographs that, if you Googled that, you'd see Tim's photographs. Carl Hiaasen's best friend. They did many stories together. And, when Tim was in high school, I should tell you this, his dad said to him, Tim, I'm going to send you up to Canada to stay with your grandmother this summer. Well, the reason was he'd been cutting down billboards with a chainsaw at night that were advertising new developments. And he was putting cement in culverts that were draining uplands into Biscayne Bay. He was I'd call it monkey wrenching, if you know who Edward Abbey was. He was trying to save the environment in the only way he knew how. And Tim is, and Carl is of that disposition too, I would say, and I am too in a way. But anyway, so Tim, about, 6 or 7 years, and he said, Tim still had a house in Miami. He hadn't quite retired from the Herald, but he said, I want you to see this house I built. And Tim was like Nathan. He could do anything. He was unlike most reporters who thumbs with hammers. And he had done this. He didn't believe in credit or borrowing money. So whenever he had money, he would save it. And when he had enough money, he would buy building materials and start building this house. And his goal was, in the Keys, he was going to build a house that could withstand a Category 10 hurricane. And he worked on it for about 18 years and finally he did it. So I went down to write about him. Miami Herald, the last couple of years of his career, he was sort of like he'd go out in the morning and he would just look for one story. He would listen to the police scanner, and if he found something interesting, he would go and photograph it and then write a long cut line or caption about what happened. Tim's house in the Keys. No a cigar, he always smoked cigars. It was his trademark. Not in the office. That house is unbelievable. It's on bridge quality pilings. The walls are 16 inches thick. The floors are 16 inches thick. If the Monroe County Building Code, which is the highest standards, hurricane standards in Florida, demanded 100 clips, hurricane clips, to attach the roof to the siding. Tim put 400 of them on there. Cistern, solar panels. He's ready for Armageddon. He built a hurricane room inside, a safe room with no windows. He went out to he liked the smell of cedar, so he went to Kentucky to a cedar plantation and felled a couple trees, and then he went back the next year, brought a portable sawmill, and milled his own lumber and built that thing. So there's Tim with an iguana. And when I decided to write about him, and I knew Carl was his best friend, I called Carl to get some Tim stories, and everybody had Tim stories. And Carl loves him, thinks that Tim is crazy. He's a gonzo guy like Hunter S. Thompson. And some of the stories included Tim's driving across Alligator Alley, across the Everglades, and he sees somebody ahead of him swing out of a lane to run over a snake. So Tim slows his truck down. He scoops up the dead snake and then hits the gas. And it took him about 20 minutes to catch the snake killer in the outskirts of Miami. And Tim jumped out of his truck and ran to the window and hammered it. And the guy said, "Oh, what?" And Tim said, "Here, we eat what we kill," and shoved the snake into his face. He was famous for bringing roadkill alligator to bring it to the Herald, and he put it in back in film days, they would keep film in refrigerators. He put it in there until he could take it home, and he'd have these barbecues. Of course, you're not supposed to stop on Alligator Alley and saw a tail off, but he would do it. Carl told me that the time they were covering a civil disturbance in Miami, Tim is driving and taking pictures. Carl's reporting. There's an editor in the back seat, and it's a dangerous situation. People have been killed. People have been dragged out of cars. It's not a good thing for the people who live there or for reporters who are reporting it, but they finish, and it's time to go home, and they start to heading, east toward Miami, and Tim says, "Wait a minute, there's a great produce stand down the street. I want to stop and get some cantaloupes." And Carl says, "Are you shitting me?" And Tim says, "This is my town. And damn it, if I want melons, I'm going to do it." So Carl said, "Tim, stop the car." Tim is big, and he just walked through this crowd that just parted. It was so audacious, and came back with his cantaloupes, and then they could go home. When Tim lived in Miami, he had a dog named, I don't know if it was called Hitler. I can't remember the name of the dog. It was called Bullet, and that dog was digging its way under the fence and getting loose, and Tim was afraid it was going to be killed. And someone said, "Well, get an electric collar and put it on it." And so Tim bought an electric collar, and then decided, well, I don't want to hurt Bullet. I'm going to try this on myself, So he did, and it knocked him on his ass. But when Carl wrote Stormy Weather, Skink catches a bad guy who's gawking at the area destroyed by Hurricane Andrew, and he has Skink putting a radio collar on that guy, an electric collar, and shocking that guy whenever he says something stupid. So Tim is the dangerous skink. Skink is a collection of people that Carl has known, but Tim is the scary skink, and he's a scary. He's a friend who I would want to have my back. He would defend me in any way he could, and he would defend Carl too, but I wouldn't want him to, because good God, what would he do? But anyway, I have talked so long, I'm a little bit hoarse, but I'm passionate about the things that I've written about and the people I've known, and I want to thank you for coming to listen. And I'm sorry. I know people had to go to the bathroom, but anyway, thanks.
Jeff, on behalf of all the Florida men and Florida women in this room, thank you so much for reintroducing us to real Florida characters. We really appreciate it. And if any of you have questions for Jeff, I'm sure he would be willing to stay for a while to answer your questions. And as he mentioned, his books are available. Are you going to be signing the books?
Oh, please don't make me do that.
Okay.
Yes, I will do that.
Whatever you want to do.
Yes. Is that Romy back there? That's Romy Gutierrez of the University Press of Florida, and she's running the show down there. And
Great.
and oh, I didn't know you were going to bring books. Yes, I did. But anyway, so please come by, and even if you're not going to buy 2 or 3 books that I really think you should, just come by to say hello, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
And thanks to all of you for coming. We really appreciate you being here. Thank you.